Story number 1. The Christmas Haunting. The town of St. Pierre was blanketed in snow, its cobblestone streets slick with ice beneath the ghostly glow of the street lamps. The distant clang of church bells echoed through the night air, signaling the arrival of Christmas Eve. It was the kind of small, forgotten place in the French countryside where nothing ever really changed, where the world seemed to stand still, as if caught in a perpetual winter. Julien and Isabelle Durand had heard about this place only recently, a centuries-old manor house hidden away in the hills, far from the bustle of Paris, far from the complications of modern life. They had planned the perfect getaway, a Christmas holiday free from the stresses of city life. They imagined long walks in the snow-covered woods, cozy fireside chats, and slow, intimate dinners in the ancient house. The innkeeper had greeted them warmly upon arrival, leading them through creaking wooden halls filled with the scent of aged wood and dust. It was the kind of house that made you feel as though you were stepping back in time, a place where the present seemed to lose its grip, where every corner whispered of history long past. "We've had many guests over the years," the innkeeper had said with a knowing smile, "but some prefer to keep to themselves. And you should, too. Some parts of the house are best left undisturbed." Isabelle laughed it off, squeezing Julien's hand. "It sounds like the perfect place for a peaceful holiday." That first night, as the wind howled outside, they sat in the large, dimly lit dining room, the table set with fine china and candles flickering in their holders. The flames from the fire danced in the hearth, casting long shadows on the walls. The silence of the night seemed almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional crack of the fire or the wind whistling through the cracks in the old walls. They ate their meal slowly, savoring the taste of duck and roasted vegetables, their conversation quiet and pleasant. But as they lingered over dessert, a strange sound cut through the stillness. Faint laughter. It was distant at first, just a soft echo that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the house. Julien raised an eyebrow, glancing at Isabelle. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Isabelle nodded slowly, her heart starting to beat faster. "It sounded like laughter. But where's it coming from?" They both stood, walking cautiously to the doorway. The house felt unusually cold, as if the walls themselves were absorbing the warmth of the fire. The laughter continued, growing louder now, and the unmistakable sound of footsteps could be heard, soft but deliberate, echoing through the halls above them. "Who's up there?" Julien called, but his voice fell flat against the silence that followed. Isabelle's face was pale, her hand tightening around his. "I don't like this, Julien. We should check it out." They moved cautiously toward the staircase, their footsteps muffled against the thick carpet. As they reached the top, the sound of footsteps ceased. The air felt thick, oppressive, as though the house itself were holding its breath. They moved slowly down the corridor, the floorboards creaking underfoot. A door stood slightly ajar at the end of the hall. It was the only door in the house that had been locked when they arrived, the only door the innkeeper had told them never to open. But tonight, that door was wide open. The light from the hallway flickered faintly against the darkened room. Inside, the air was frigid, and the shadows in the corners seemed to shift with a mind of their own. It took a moment for their eyes to adjust, but when they did, they saw it. The grand piano, a dust-covered relic of a bygone era, sat silently in the corner of the room. Yet, despite its stillness, the keys seemed to move of their own accord, as if invisible hands were pressing them down, creating a soft, haunting melody. Isabelle gasped, stepping back. "What is happening here?" Julien, too stunned to speak, reached out and grabbed her arm, pulling her away from the door. They ran back down the hallway, only to stop dead in their tracks when they saw the hallway light flicker and dim. Someone, was there with them, presence, cold and suffocating, that seemed to fill the entire space. "Isabelle," Julien's voice cracked. "We need to leave. Now." But as they turned to flee, The door at the end of the hall slammed shut, as if of its own accord. The laughter they had heard earlier was now unmistakable, louder and closer than ever, ringing in their ears. "Who is there?" Julian shouted, his voice trembling. "What do you want?" But no answer came. Instead, the sound of footsteps resumed, this time coming from all around them, from the corners of the hall, from beneath the floorboards, from the very walls themselves. The temperature dropped further, frost creeping along the edges of the windows, and the faint scent of perfume, old and musty, filled the air. Isabel stumbled backward, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "This place, it's not right. We have to go." But before they could move, the door to the room creaked open again, and a figure appeared in the doorway. It was a woman, but not a woman as they knew her. Her face was obscured by shadows, her features indistinct, as if she were made of smoke and fog. She stood still, her presence filling the space with an overwhelming sense of sorrow. In the soft light, they could see a faint shimmer in the air around her, a spectral glow that seemed to pulse with an energy all its own. The woman did not speak. She did not move. But as Isabel and Julian stood frozen in place, the house seemed to groan and shift around them, the laughter and footsteps now merging into a cacophony of disembodied voices. Then, in an instant, the woman was gone, leaving only the lingering echo of her presence. The room was silent once more, the piano no longer playing, the footsteps and laughter vanishing into the void. With a trembling hand, Isabel reached for Julian, and they ran as fast as they could, down the staircase and out into the snow. The cold outside was nothing compared to the chill that had gripped them inside. They didn't stop until they reached the village, where the innkeeper was waiting, a knowing expression on his face. "You were not supposed to open that door," he said softly, almost apologetically. "Some things are better left forgotten." The Durans never spoke of that night again. They left the village, never to return, and the house on the hill stood empty for many years. The innkeeper was right. Some things, especially on Christmas Eve, are better left undisturbed. And in the silence of the cold, empty rooms, the ghost still waited not to harm, but to be remembered, to be seen once more, on the longest night of the year. Story number 2. The Christmas Eve Shadows. It was the kind of winter night that made you want to stay inside, nestled by a fire with a mug of hot chocolate. A thick blanket of snow had settled over the small house in rural Canada. The world outside muffled and still. The gray sky hung low, but inside, warmth radiated from the crackling hearth, and the faint scent of pine from the Christmas tree drifted through the air. It was the perfect setting for a family to gather together and celebrate the holiday season. Maggie Sinclair smiled as she watched her family settle into their familiar routines. Her husband, Jonathan, carved the roast, while their teenage son, Ethan, grumbled as he fiddled with his phone at the table. Their daughter, Clara, was enthusiastically recounting her school's Christmas play, her words tumbling out as she spoke of the excitement she'd felt standing in front of the audience. It was a scene Maggie had seen 100 times before, yet tonight there was something different, something that she couldn't quite shake. The first time it happened was when Jonathan lifted the roast from the oven, a soft hiss of steam rising into the air. Maggie glanced toward the window and caught sight of something moving outside, just past the frosted panes. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, perhaps a stray animal crossing the yard, or the wind playing tricks on the snow. But as she watched, she saw it again, dark shapes shifting in and out of view, moving quickly past the window. "John," she said, her voice a little too sharp. "Did you see that?" Jonathan looked up from the counter, his brow furrowing. "See what?" "There's something outside," she said, standing up from the table. Her heart began to beat faster. It was moving by the window. Jonathan wiped his hands on a towel and walked over to her. "I don't see anything. Probably just the wind or the branches. You know how those trees can look strange at night." Maggie nodded. But she wasn't convinced. She looked out the window again. But the yard was empty. Just the soft gleam of the snow reflecting the dim light from inside the house. Probably nothing, she muttered, returning to her seat. Dinner resumed with little more mention of the strange sight. The conversation turned to other things, holiday plans, family jokes, and the usual holiday chatter. But Maggie couldn't help herself. Her gaze kept drifting to the window. The shadows outside seemed to flicker at the edge of her vision. Just out of reach. She could swear they were moving again. When the meal was done and the last remnants of pie were eaten, the family settled in front of the fireplace. Ethan put his phone down, and Clara curled up on the couch, her face bathed in the golden glow of the firelight. Jonathan had a book in hand, but Maggie couldn't focus. She kept seeing those shadows, like dark figures moving around the house. Every time she looked, they seemed to grow more defined, more deliberate in their movement. "Clara, would you mind checking the back door?" Jonathan asked. "I thought I heard something banging out there earlier." Clara, eager for something to do, immediately jumped up and headed toward the back of the house. Maggie couldn't help but follow her with her eyes, noticing the way the girl's figure seemed to blend with the shadows as she passed into the hallway. It was a silly thing to think, but Maggie felt a cold shiver ripple down her spine. There was something not right about tonight. The air felt heavier than usual, and even the fire seemed to crackle with a strange intensity. Just as Clara was about to open the door, Maggie heard it. A low creak from upstairs, the kind of creak that old wood makes when someone is walking across the floor. Maggie's heart skipped a beat. She had the sudden, inexplicable feeling that someone else was in the house. Someone who wasn't supposed to be. "Clara?" Maggie called out, her voice tighter than usual. The girl paused, then glanced over her shoulder. "Yeah, Mom. Did you hear that?" Clara tilted her head. "Hear what?" But before Maggie could respond, a loud thud echoed through the house from above, followed by the unmistakable sound of someone moving around upstairs. The noise was unmistakable now. A heavy footstep, followed by the sound of a door opening and closing. Jonathan dropped the book in his lap and stood up. "What the hell is that?" he muttered. Maggie's pulse quickened. I don't know. I'll check it out," Jonathan said, already heading toward the stairs. "No," Maggie said quickly, rising from her seat. "We should all check it out together. Could be a burglar." Clara moved toward the stairs reluctantly, but Maggie felt her heart race as they ascended, the house seeming eerily quiet now, the only sound their footsteps echoing in the darkened hallway. They reached the top of the stairs and stood in the hallway. The bedroom doors were all shut, but the bathroom door was slightly ajar, a sliver of light spilling out into the darkness. Jonathan reached for the door, and just as his hand touched the handle, a loud crash came from inside the room. The family jumped back in shock. And then, the unmistakable sound of footsteps from inside the room, began to move toward them. "Who's there?" Jonathan shouted, his voice shaking. The footsteps stopped. Then, a low whisper, so faint that Maggie wasn't sure if she imagined it, seemed to crawl through the air. "Go away." Maggie felt her throat tighten. It wasn't her imagination. Something was in this house, something that shouldn't be. Jonathan swung open the door. The room was empty. They rushed in, searching every corner. Under the bed, in the closet. Nothing. The room was untouched. The air inside was thick and heavy, but there was no sign of anyone. No intruder. No one. Then, Maggie's breath caught in her throat as she looked down. The rug by the door had been moved, just slightly, but enough to reveal an old, faded footprint in the dust. The footprint, clearly too small to be Jonathan's or Clara's, was almost like a child's. "Who's been in here?" Maggie whispered, her voice shaking. Jonathan grabbed her arm. "We need to leave. Now." They rushed downstairs, but as they passed the front window, they saw something that froze them in place. Outside, in the snow, were dozens of dark figures, shadows moving in and out of view. each one darting around the house, circling it. Some were even peering in through the windows, their faces hidden in the dark. Maggie's breath caught in her chest as she turned back toward the door. No, this isn't happening. This can't be real. But it was. The shadows continued to move, slow and deliberate, until finally, as if responding to an unspoken command, they all stopped, and in the deep, oppressive silence that followed, the shadows seemed to turn toward them, and then, just as quickly as they had appeared, the figures vanished into the night. By morning, the family had left. The car was packed, and they didn't look back. No one spoke of it again. But as Maggie sat at the kitchen table a week later, sipping her coffee, she saw something out of the corner of her eye, a fleeting shadow darting past the window. And for the rest of her life, every Christmas Eve, the shadows returned. Story number 3. The Christmas Ghost. It was a cold, crisp Christmas Eve in a small, remote village in Scotland. Snow fell in soft flakes from the sky, dusting the windowsill and the cobblestone streets outside. The scent of pine mixed with the smell of roasting turkey and cinnamon wafted through the old stone house of the MacLeod family. For generations, this house had stood as a symbol of family unity, with every Christmas Eve being spent together, except this year was different. Clara MacLeod had always loved Christmas. The tradition, the warmth of family, the festive meals, they all held a special place in her heart. But this year, a certain heaviness lingered in the air. It had been 2 years since her mother, Margaret MacLeod, passed away on Christmas Day. The holidays had lost their magic since then, leaving Clara with a gnawing emptiness. Tonight, the family was gathered once again, trying to keep the spirits alive for the sake of the younger children. Clara's father, Malcolm, a stout man with graying hair, was carving the turkey at the kitchen table, while her younger sister, Fiona, and her husband, Kevin, decorated the table with holly and candles. The children were in the living room, eagerly awaiting the arrival of Santa Claus. Clara, however, was distant. She had been lost in thought, staring into the crackling fire. Every year, she felt her mother's absence more deeply. Margaret had always been the heart of their home, the one who ensured that Christmas was perfect, no matter what. Now, there was only an echo of her laughter in the walls, a distant hum of memories. As Clara absent-mindedly stared at the fire, she felt a strange tug in her chest. Something was off. She glanced around the room. The familiar shadows cast by the fire seemed more oppressive than usual. The air had turned cold, unnaturally so, as if the warmth had been sucked out of the room. The lights of the Christmas tree flickered for a brief second, and she heard a sound, like a faint rustle of fabric. Then, she saw it, a figure, standing in the far corner of the room near the window. At first, Clara thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the movement of the flames. But as she looked more closely, she realized with a sudden chill that it wasn't just a shadow. It was a figure, a woman, standing still as stone, her face obscured by the darkness. The figure's outline was indistinct, like smoke caught in a beam of light, and Clara's heart began to race. She blinked, trying to make sense of it, but the figure didn't move. It stood there, silent and unmoving. A heavy silence filled the room, suffocating in its intensity. "Mom," Clara whispered, her voice cracking. The figure shifted slightly, as if it had heard her. A faint chill swept through the room, and Clara's breath caught in her throat. She could feel the weight of the presence in the room, like a cold hand had just brushed against the nape of her neck. "Mom," Clara repeated, louder this time, her voice trembling. The figure's head turned ever so slightly, but Clara couldn't see its face. There was only an empty void where eyes should be, an absence that seemed to stretch into nothingness. And then, as if responding to her voice, the figure slowly began to dissipate, fading into the air, leaving nothing but the cold. Clara froze, her breath shallow, her chest tight, her heart thudded in her ears. She stumbled backward, her hands gripping the back of the chair for support. "Clara?" Her father's voice called from the kitchen. Clara blinked, and when she opened her eyes, the room was normal again. No figure in the corner, no chill in the air, just the warmth of the fire and the soft crackling of the logs. She looked toward the corner again, but it was empty. She tried to steady herself, but the memory of what she had just seen gripped her. "Clara, are you all right?" Malcolm asked, stepping into the living room, his brow furrowed with concern. He noticed her pale face, her wide eyes, and his concern deepened. "You look as though you've seen a ghost." I think I have," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. Her father looked at her with skepticism. "What are you talking about?" Clara's gaze drifted to the corner of the room once more, as if she were hoping to catch a glimpse of the figure again. But there was nothing, just the ordinary trappings of Christmas. The tree, the garlands, the lights, and the scent of pine. "I saw her, Dad. I saw Mom. She was here, standing right there," Clara said, her voice breaking as she gestured toward the corner where the figure had been. Malcolm's expression softened, but he shook his head. "Clara, it's been 2 years. You know how grief can play tricks on the mind. It's just a memory, a shadow. You miss her. I know you do. But—" "No," Clara snapped, her voice sharp, her hands trembling. "No, it wasn't a shadow. It wasn't just a memory. She was here. I swear to God. She was here. Standing right there." Malcolm stepped closer, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Shoo, calm down. It's all right." But Clara could not calm down. The image of her mother, standing in the corner of the room, was burned into her mind. The absence of her face, the hollow eyes, and the way the figure had vanished before her eyes, they haunted her, gnawing at her sanity. She couldn't explain it, couldn't understand it, but the presence was unmistakable. Her mother had returned. Clara tried to shake off the feeling, but it clung to her like a shadow. The dinner went on as usual, though Clara was distant, her mind trapped in that moment. The sounds of laughter and holiday cheer felt distant to her, like she was no longer part of it. The shadow of the ghost hung over the night. Later that evening, as the family gathered around the table for dinner, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. Every time she looked up, she expected to see the figure of her mother standing at the edge of the room, silently observing. But the room was empty. It wasn't until after dessert, when Clara was alone in the living room, that she finally let the tears fall. The grief, the confusion, the overwhelming need to believe that her mother had somehow come back to her. It all washed over her in a rush. She sank to her knees by the fireplace, her sobs echoing through the empty house. And then, as if in answer to her pain, she heard a soft whisper in the air, a familiar voice, so faint, so fragile. It was her mother's voice. "Clara, darling." The voice said, barely audible, "I never left." Clara's heart stopped. She looked around the room, but there was no one there. The air was heavy, thick with an unspoken presence. And then, in the corner of her eye, she saw it once more, the faintest shadow, hovering in the darkness. For a moment, Clara felt a sense of peace, of closure. Her mother hadn't gone. She was still there, watching over her, even if just in spirit. And as the clock struck midnight, Clara whispered into the empty room, her voice barely a breath. "Happy Christmas, Mom." The wind outside howled through the trees, but inside, Clara knew that the Christmas ghost, her mother, was never truly gone. Story number 4. The Mysterious Christmas Eve Caller. The night was silent, save for the soft hum of the Christmas tree lights and the distant sound of the wind rustling through the California pines. It was one of those rare December evenings where the air, though crisp, held a certain warmth, a holiday warmth that made the whole house feel like it was wrapped in a blanket. For the Hanley family, it was the perfect Christmas Eve. Riley Hanley, a man in his late 40s with a salt and pepper beard, sat in his favorite chair by the fireplace. His wife, Julia, was in the kitchen, humming a tune as she prepared their Christmas dinner. Their two children, Henry and Lily, were upstairs, playing with the toys they had gotten earlier that day. There was a sense of comfort in the quietness of the evening, a peace that only the holidays could bring. At 10:34 p.m., the phone rang. It wasn't unusual. There were plenty of people who called on Christmas Eve, especially relatives who lived far away. But there was something off about this call, something that didn't sit right from the moment Riley picked up the receiver. "Hello?" he said, his voice thick with the warmth of the wine he'd been sipping earlier. For a long moment, there was nothing but a breath, a slow, labored inhale that echoed through the line. Riley's eyebrows furrowed in confusion. He pulled the receiver away from his ear for a second, then pressed it back. "Hello?" he repeated, a little louder this time, but still no answer. The breath on the other end was shallow, like someone struggling to catch their breath. But there was no other sound. Then, a voice, quiet at first, low and distorted, as if it was coming from far away. "Riley." His heart skipped a beat. The voice sounded like his brother, Patrick, who had passed away 2 years ago in a car accident. "Patrick," Riley said, his voice tight. His hand gripped the phone harder. But there was no response, only the rasping breath and the faint whisper that sent a shiver up his spine. Riley's mind raced. Patrick had been gone for so long. How could it be him? Could it be a prank? Some sick joke from a friend? No, the voice was too real, too familiar. "Riley, help me." The words hung in the air, jagged, desperate. Then, suddenly, there was a crackling noise, as if the line was about to break. Riley leaned forward in his chair, his pulse quickening. "I don't understand. What do you mean? Help you?" he asked, his voice now laced with concern. But the words were already gone. Instead, there was a sound, a scraping, faint but unmistakable, like fingernails dragging across a chalkboard. The noise was so sharp, so jarring, it made his teeth ache. His heart pounded in his chest. And then, just as suddenly as the call had begun, it ended. The line went silent. Riley sat there, the phone pressed to his ear, not moving, not breathing. His thoughts whirled in a chaotic spiral. He tried to shake the image of Patrick's face out of his mind, but it lingered. How could it have been him? Patrick had died in a car crash, the kind of crash that left no room for any afterlife, no lingering presence. He glanced at the clock. 10:39 p.m. The call had lasted a mere 5 minutes, but the echo of it would haunt him for much longer. Julia walked into the living room, holding a steaming cup of tea. She took one look at her husband's pale face, his hand still gripping the phone, and raised an eyebrow. "Riley? What happened?" He stared at the phone, his lips dry, but he couldn't find the words. He knew he should tell her, but he was still trying to make sense of it. Could it have been a prank? But why was the voice so real? Why had it sounded like Patrick? I think I just got a call from Patrick," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Julia's brow furrowed in confusion. "Patrick? But he died 2 years ago. Riley, you're not saying—" "I don't know," Riley muttered, shaking his head. It couldn't have been him, but it sounded just like him. And the words, "Help me." She reached out, placing her hand gently on his arm. Maybe it was a mistake, a glitch in the system. There's no way. But Riley wasn't listening anymore. He had stood up, walking toward the window, staring into the dark night. He could feel it now, the weight of something watching him, something waiting. Julia watched him for a moment, then turned to the phone on the table. The silence that followed seemed too heavy, too final. "Do you think it was really Patrick?" she asked, her voice quiet. Riley couldn't answer. He just kept staring into the night, his thoughts dark and jumbled. Outside, the Christmas lights blinked cheerily, casting their soft glow against the snow. But something had changed, something that Riley couldn't explain. The air felt colder, denser, as though the world had tilted just a little. making him feel like he was standing on the edge of something he didn't want to face. And then, the phone rang again. This time, there was no mistaking it. Riley knew exactly who it was. But it wasn't Patrick. The voice that came through the receiver was different. Softer, quieter, but still distinctly human. And yet, it sent a chill through his bones. One that froze his heart in its tracks. "Riley," the voice whispered. His hand dropped the phone as his eyes darted around the room. He turned to Julia, who had now noticed the odd expression on his face. "What is it?" she asked, looking frightened. He didn't answer. Instead, he walked slowly to the door, staring at it, as if he could feel the presence outside. He didn't know how he knew, but he could sense it, hear it, a faint tapping on the window. The phone calls stopped after that night, but the unease remained, the feeling of being watched, the sensation of something lingering just out of sight. The presence that had first revealed itself on Christmas Eve would not be so easily shaken off. Riley never answered the phone again when it rang on Christmas Eve, and no one in the family ever spoke of it again, though they all knew, somewhere, deep inside, they knew that the spirit of Patrick had returned, not for a reunion, but to remind them that some people never really leave, that some souls can't find peace, and that no matter how hard we try to forget, the dead always have their way of calling us home. And on every Christmas Eve thereafter, Riley would always check the phone, knowing that the caller would be waiting, always waiting. Story number 5. The Haunted Christmas Tree. The tree was beautiful. At least, that's what they told themselves. It was Christmas Eve when the Roberts family decided to buy it, an innocent enough decision. Nothing more than a last-minute dash to the local market for a tree. Christmas had crept up on them that year, as it so often does when life is too busy, too chaotic, and too filled with the grind of things that matter far less than they should. Helen and David, the parents, wanted something to bring the holiday spirit back into their home, something that would lift their spirits. After the last few years of difficulty, loss, and quiet distance, they found the tree at a tiny, rundown shop near the edge of town, tucked between a bakery and a secondhand store. The old man who ran the place, Mr. Ambrose, as the sign outside read, didn't say much as they wandered through the dark aisles of trees. The whole shop smelled of wood, resin, and a faint trace of mildew, but there was something oddly comforting about the place. Even if the air felt thick with memories long forgotten, it was the kind of shop you only found in small towns. And Helen thought that was what made it special. It reminded her of the trees her parents used to pick out when she was a little girl. When she saw the tree, it seemed perfect, tall and bushy, with dark green needles that almost shimmered in the soft light of the shop. There were no glaring imperfections in its shape, nothing too crooked or uneven. Its deep green branches swayed in the breeze when the door opened, sending a cool, fresh scent of pine into the air. It looked like it belonged in a Christmas card, the kind you'd see on store shelves. David had his doubts at first. "You're sure this is the one?" he asked, eyeing the tree nervously. But Helen was sure. "It's perfect," she said. "It'll bring some cheer into this house." And so they bought it. When they brought the tree home, they wasted no time decorating it. They were behind on everything: decorations, shopping, the Christmas dinner. The kids, Tommy and Lucy, helped hang baubles and silver tinsel. The air filled with the rustling of wrapping paper and the smell of the freshly cut pine. They weren't particularly close-knit anymore. Not the way they used to be. There were always distractions, always reasons for the family to be apart. But tonight, there was something about the tree. It almost seemed to draw them all closer together. As they finished, Tommy ran over to the window, tapping at the glass. "Look, it's snowing," he shouted, his face pressed up against the cold surface. Lucy giggled, her small hand reaching up to tug on the Christmas lights. "Let's leave the lights on all night," she exclaimed, as if the tree were the most magical thing in the world. But it was then that the first strange noise came, a soft scuffling sound, like a small child dragging their feet across the floor. came from the hallway, just beyond the living room. Helen and David exchanged a glance. "It's probably just the kids playing," David said, dismissing it. But even as he said the words, there was a strange sense of unease in the air. Helen smiled, trying to reassure herself. "Let's sit down by the tree. Enjoy the holiday." But she could feel a tightness in her chest, something she couldn't explain, and she knew it wasn't just the rush of the season. That night, after they'd all gone to bed, the noises returned. It started softly at first, little footsteps pacing around the tree, the creaking of floorboards under something light. Then it grew louder, a soft, high-pitched giggling, just faint enough to make her wonder if she was hearing things. Helen lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening. The giggling continued, drifting through the house, echoing from somewhere far off, as if it came from a place beyond the walls themselves. David, already asleep beside her, didn't stir, but Helen couldn't ignore the sound anymore. She got up, her bare feet cold on the wooden floor. When she walked into the living room, the tree was exactly as they had left it. Lights twinkling softly in the darkness, ornaments glittering like stars. But there, on the edge of her vision, was something strange, a faint, shadowy figure, just beyond the tree's branches. It was a silhouette, a little girl, hunched over, her face hidden in the shadows. Helen blinked, and when her eyes cleared, the figure was gone. Over the next few days, the odd occurrences grew more frequent. It started with small things, stray ornaments lying on the floor in the morning, the odd rustle of something moving behind the walls, flickers of light in the corner of her eye. But then it escalated. One night, after Helen and David had gone to bed, Lucy screamed from her room. Rushing in, they found her wide-eyed, pointing at the Christmas tree. "The angel is moving," she cried, trembling. Helen rushed to the tree, only to find that the angel perched atop it had, in fact, shifted from its original position. "Lucy, it's just the wind," Helen said, trying to calm her daughter, but her hands shook as she reached for the angel, feeling a strange chill that wasn't caused by the cold night air. The next morning, when they woke up, Tommy found something even stranger. A string of pearls that had been draped across the tree, curling around the branches as if they had been placed there overnight. But none of them had done it. It wasn't long before Helen began to feel an overwhelming sense of dread in the house. Constant, heavy feeling that weighed down her chest. It was as if something was watching them, something old and angry. The giggling grew louder, and sometimes, Helen swore she heard soft footsteps behind her as she moved around the house. One night, she could stand it no longer. She pulled David aside, her face pale and drawn. "We need to get rid of the tree," she whispered urgently. But David wouldn't hear it. He laughed it off. "It's just a Christmas tree. Helen, you're imagining things." But that night, the events reached their peak. Helen woke up to the sound of a child's laughter, clear, bright, and unmistakable. It was no longer in the distance. It was right next to her, beside her bed. The temperature in the room dropped so fast it left her breath visible in the air. As she turned to her side, her heart stopped. The figure of a child stood at the foot of her bed, small, wearing an old-fashioned dress with a singed hem. Her face was burned and blackened, her eyes hollow. Helen screamed, and the figure vanished in a puff of smoke. The next morning, they went to the shop where they had bought the tree. The old man behind the counter greeted them with a slow, knowing smile. "Ah, you found the tree," he said, his voice raspy and dry. David frowned. "What's going on with it?" "It's haunted. The tree is haunted. We need to know what's going on." The old man's eyes grew distant, and he sighed. "That tree belonged to a family. Long ago, they lost everything in a fire, everything except that tree. The fire claimed their lives, but the spirit of their daughter remained, still trapped in that tree. The fire took them all, but their souls, well, they never left." Helen and David were silent. Their hearts sank in their chests. You should have never brought it home, the old man muttered, almost to himself. You can't leave. Once you take it in, it doesn't let go. They never celebrated Christmas in that house again. The tree was taken back, and the house felt empty, as if the spirit of something lost had left with it. And yet, every year when Christmas approached, Helen could still hear that same soft, distant giggling in the house, the giggling of a child who had no place to go, the giggling of a child who was never going to leave. Story number 6. The Christmas Eve Intruder. The first snowflakes of Christmas Eve drifted down like feathers in the cold Michigan night. The lights from the Christmas tree twinkled through the living room window, reflecting off the snow and casting a soft, almost magical glow throughout the house. It was a picture-perfect Christmas Eve, the kind of evening you dream about during the bitter months leading up to December. It was just us, me, my wife, Julie, and our 2 children, Emma and Lucas. The house was old, built in the 1930s, with creaking floorboards and narrow, crooked hallways, but it was ours, and it felt like home. We'd only moved in a few months before, just before Thanksgiving, and though the house had its quirks, we had grown accustomed to them. The strange groans of the wood at night, the rattling of the windows when the wind howled, the soft hiss of the radiator as it kicked on in the dead of night. These were the sounds of a home that had seen decades of history. That night, as we gathered around the tree, passing gifts and savoring the warmth of family, everything felt right. It was the perfect Christmas Eve until it wasn't. It started with the sound. It was a soft thud, like something or someone had dropped onto the floor above. I glanced up, my heart skipping a beat. Julie, always the calm one, smiled and reassured the kids that it was probably just the house settling. It was a comforting thought, but one that didn't sit quite right with me. The noise was too distinct, too deliberate. The thud was followed by a dragging sound, faint but unmistakable. Probably just the wind, I said, though I didn't believe it. Julie kissed me on the cheek and suggested I go upstairs and check things out. The kids are fine, and they're happy with their presents, she said. Go on. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and headed up the stairs, trying to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The stairs creaked under my weight, the old wood groaning as I climbed to the second floor. The hallway was cold, and the air felt still, almost too still. The only sound was the faint ticking of the clock in the hallway and the muffled hum of the radiator. I checked the first bedroom, nothing. The second bedroom, nothing. But as I reached the third, the master bedroom, I noticed something strange. The window was wide open, the curtains billowing gently in the night air. I froze. It had been closed tightly just before we sat down for the Christmas celebration. I knew it because I had closed it myself. The cold air nipped at my face, and I felt a coldness creep down my spine. I glanced out the window. There, on the snow-covered ground below, were fresh footprints, large, deep prints that led from the back of the house to the window. No one had come in through the front door. It was locked, as it always was, and there was no sign of anyone leaving the house. I quickly shut the window and turned back, my heart pounding in my chest. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. I rushed downstairs, my mind racing with thoughts I didn't want to entertain. I tried to act normal, for Julie's sake, for the kids, but the house felt wrong. That night, we all slept fitfully. Julie had to comfort Emma after she woke up from a nightmare, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. Mom, I heard something, Emma whispered, trembling. Someone was in the house. Julie reassured her, but my unease only grew. The next day, Christmas Day, was when the oddities truly began. We had breakfast together, but the lingering sense of something out of place was impossible to ignore. First, it was small things, items that had been moved overnight. A chair in the living room, which we had all left neatly arranged around the tree, was now askew. The coat hooks in the hallway, where we'd hung our outerwear the previous night, were empty, though I clearly remembered hanging my coat there. And then there was the laughter. It wasn't the children, who were playing quietly in the next room. It wasn't Julie or me, either. It was a low, soft giggle, almost childlike, that seemed to come from the kitchen. I froze. My blood ran cold. I went to the kitchen, my steps slow and deliberate. But the kitchen was empty, except for the sound of the old refrigerator humming in the corner. The air felt colder here, too, much colder. I turned back to see Lucas standing in the doorway. His face was pale, his eyes wide with confusion. "Dad, who's that?" he asked, his voice trembling. I glanced toward the spot where Lucas was pointing. There, standing just beyond the kitchen doorway, was a figure. It was blurry at first, like a shadow in the periphery of my vision. But when I turned my full gaze upon it, it vanished, just as quickly as it had appeared. My heart skipped a beat. "I didn't see anything," I said, trying to sound calm, though my voice cracked. "There's nothing there, buddy. Just your imagination." But the laughter didn't stop. It continued to echo through the house, soft and taunting, the kind of laugh that sent a chill down your spine. That evening, we all gathered in the living room once more, trying to salvage what was left of the holiday. But as we settled in, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A set of footprints in the snow outside the front door, leading from the house toward the woods. I hadn't heard anyone leave. The footprints were fresh, crisp in the fresh snow, and they led away from the house, toward the dense forest behind the property. Julie noticed them too, her face drained of color as she slowly turned to look at me. "What's going on?" she asked. "This isn't right, John." I couldn't argue with that. That night, as we huddled together under blankets on the couch, we heard it again. The soft giggling came from upstairs this time, faint and eerie, as if it was just beyond the walls, lingering in the shadows. We didn't sleep. We couldn't. The sounds continued all night long. The soft creak of footsteps on the floor above. The echo of laughter that would die just as quickly as it had begun. We kept the lights on, but the darkness outside pressed in, feeling closer, tighter, as if the house itself was closing in on us. The next morning, we were gone, packed up and out before sunrise. I don't know if Julie even remembered to grab her coat. I certainly didn't remember mine. We didn't look back as we drove away, the house fading behind us like a forgotten memory. Weeks later, I did some digging. The house had a history, a dark one. It had been abandoned for years before we moved in. But before that, it had been the site of a tragedy. A family had lived there, a mother and father, with their 2 children. They had vanished without a trace one snowy Christmas Eve, just like us, leaving nothing behind but footprints in the snow. The locals had always whispered about the house, about the strange things that happened there. Now, I wonder, did we experience it all because of the tragedy that had occurred there before? Or was there something else? All I know is, I'll never set foot in Michigan again, and I'll never spend another Christmas anywhere near that damned house. Story number 7. The Christmas Spirit at the Hotel. I had never planned on spending Christmas in a hotel, let alone one like the Windsor in Colorado. It was a last-minute decision, an impulse fueled by a last-minute flight. I canceled Christmas with family, and the overwhelming need to escape. The hotel had an old-world charm, the kind you don't see much anymore. The faded elegance of a bygone era, the creaking floors, the antique furniture that seemed to swallow the light. It was the kind of place where you expected to see a bellboy in a tweed suit, guiding you through a lobby filled with the smell of fresh pine and wood burning in an unseen fireplace. But it wasn't the hotel's charm that kept me there that night. It was the cold, the deep, unshakable chill that settled in the bones of the building, more intense than the freezing December air outside. Maybe it was just my nerves, or maybe it was something else, something older. I arrived late, a few hours after sunset, tired and irritable, my spirits already low. The clerk at the front desk greeted me with a practiced smile, too practiced, almost rehearsed, as if he had said the same thing to hundreds of people before me. "Welcome to the Windsor. We hope you enjoy your stay. I nodded, gave him a polite smile, and accepted the keycard. I could see it in his eyes. There was something he wasn't telling me, some dark knowledge buried in the back of his mind. But I was too tired to dig deeper, to push. The last thing I wanted was to hear stories about haunted hotels and ghostly visitors. Not tonight, not on Christmas Eve. The room was quiet, tucked away on the third floor, far from the lobby and any potential noise. The bed looked inviting, and I made quick work of undressing, slipping under the heavy covers. The warmth was a relief, even if the air still felt damp and heavy. Outside the window, the storm raged on, snow falling in soft, steady sheets, the occasional gust of wind making the glass rattle in its frame. I drifted off to sleep with the faint sound of a grandfather clock ticking somewhere in the hotel. Maybe it was the stress, or maybe the loneliness of being away from family on Christmas. But I was already half dreaming when the noise started. It was soft at first. Tap, tap, tap from somewhere down the hall. A footstep. Maybe. I rolled over, dismissing it as the usual creaks of an old hotel. But then it came again, louder this time. A slow, deliberate step. Step, step. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps weren't coming from the hallway outside my door. They were coming from inside the room. I sat up in bed, staring into the dark. The footsteps were now unmistakable, echoing through the silence of the room. Slowly, I stood, my feet cold against the hardwood floor. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I tiptoed toward the door. I couldn't explain it, but something about those footsteps felt wrong. Not just a passing sound, but a presence, an awareness. I reached the door and gently turned the handle, my hand shaking. The hallway outside was empty, silent as the grave. No sign of anyone, no other guest in sight, just the soft, flickering lights overhead, casting long, shadowy tendrils against the walls. But then I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of feet moving across the floor. It was coming from down the hallway, toward me, slowly, as though the person, or thing, was deliberately walking just out of sight. My pulse quickened. I stepped back, retreating into the room, my body stiff with the sensation of being watched. That's when I saw it. A shadow, thin and elongated, crossing the hallway. It passed beneath the light like a cloud moving over the moon, dark, intangible, but somehow real. I could feel my breath catch in my throat. My eyes were locked on the shadow, unable to look away. It was moving with a purpose, slowly, deliberately, the sound of its steps growing louder with every passing second. Step, 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 then silence. I didn't know how long I stood there, staring at the spot where the shadow had been. Minutes? Hours? Time seemed to stretch, and the temperature in the room had plummeted. I could see my breath fogging in the air. The hotel was still, too still, and I knew without a doubt that something was waiting for me. I returned to the bed, my mind racing, my pulse throbbing in my ears. I tried to close my eyes, tried to sleep, but the silence pressed down on me like a weight. And then, from somewhere deep within the hotel, came a sound that made my blood run cold. The unmistakable chime of a bell. Ding. The sound echoed down the hallway, from the far end of the building. It was like the tolling of a bell marking the passing of time. But it wasn't the clock that had chimed. It was something else. Something that shouldn't have been there. Something that couldn't be there. And then, I heard it again, closer this time. The footfalls. The steady, rhythmic sound of someone walking toward my room. But this time, there was no mistaking it. It wasn't just footsteps. It was a voice. A whisper. Barely audible, but clear enough. Come, join us. The words slithered through the cracks of the door like cold air, wrapping around my chest like icy fingers. I wanted to scream, to shout, but my voice was frozen, caught in the back of my throat. I could only stand there, rooted to the spot, waiting for whatever was on the other side. The door handle rattled, slowly, as though someone was trying to open it. I backed away, pressing my back against the wall, my legs trembling beneath me. The door shuddered, and I realized it was going to open. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, I grabbed my coat and threw open the window, shivering as the cold air rushed in. There was no time to think, no time to wonder what was going on. All I knew was that I needed to escape. I climbed out onto the fire escape, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and that was when I saw it. The figure, standing in the shadow of the hotel, looking up at me with hollow eyes. It was a man, or something that looked like a man, dressed in a long, black coat, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. He stood motionless, like a statue, and I knew, without a doubt, that he was waiting for me. I didn't wait to find out who or what he was. I ran. I didn't stop running until I was far from the hotel, my heart pounding with every step, my legs burning with the effort. And when I looked back, the hotel was just a shadow in the distance, its windows dark and empty. But even now, every Christmas, when the first snow falls and the air turns cold, I hear those footsteps, in the dead of night, quiet at first, then louder, and the voice, always the voice. Come, join us. Somewhere, deep inside the Windsor, the spirits of those who had come before me still linger, waiting for their next guest. And as the bell tolls on Christmas Eve, I wonder if I'll ever truly escape them.